Good morning and welcome to the first Fleets in Charge webinar of 2022. This morning we're going to be talking about charging and untangling the charging conundrum. We've got some fantastic speakers lined up for this morning. I will also be sharing some insights for some research that we've recently conducted and that we're looking to publish next week. Without further ado, I'll start off with some housekeeping for this morning. So just to remind people that the webinar is being recorded. This will be available on the BVRLA's website afterwards, along with other webinars that we've run. A reminder that all BVRLA meetings and events are held in compliance with competition law. So if we just put up the competition law slide, please do refrain from any of those areas that are highlighted in red. So please do not discuss anything that relates to pricing, territories, new marketing plans. But in particular, please don't mention anything that specifically relates to any individual suppliers or customers. Having said that, we're really keen that you do have some lively chat, debate, and put questions in the Q&A box. You can find that on the top right-hand side of your screen. To kick us off this morning, I'd like to start with a poll. So if you go to the poll tab, this is where you'll see this demonstrated. So the first question for this morning to kick us off is, do you think that charging infrastructure is on track to meet the 2030 petrol and diesel phase-out date? Options are infrastructure will be more than ready for 2030. It's currently on track. Only if some extra support is provided, and no, lots more work is required. So whilst you vote on that, I'm going to introduce Katie Black, who's our first speaker this morning. So Katie, if you'd like to join me on stage. So Katie Black is the head of Office for Zero Emission Vehicles. And Katie's going to give us the latest decarbonisation update from government. And then Katie will stay for some Q&A at the end. So please do look at that Q&A tab on the right-hand side and pose any questions to Katie. So Katie, over to you.
Good morning. Thanks so much for having me. I'm just going to change my microphone. Sorry. No, I think that's working fine. Okay, apologies. I just want to make sure you can all hear me as clearly as possible. So thank you so much for having me. My name's Katie Black. I'm one of the joint heads of the Office for Zero Emission Vehicles. There's 3 of us in charge. So I work alongside Natasha Robinson and Gary Cook, who I'm sure that many of you have had a chance to meet. But I joined the Office for Zero Emission Vehicle just over a year ago, and my role mainly focuses on infrastructure strategy, electric vehicle charging infrastructure strategy, and en route ultra rapid charging. And one of the big things that we've been working on over the past year is an electric vehicle charging infrastructure strategy. And I accepted this invite as confident as you could be that we would have managed to publish it by now. But as is the way with government, it's still working its way through the system and will arrive in due course. But in the meantime, if you're looking for an overview of everything that government is doing in this space on electric vehicles more broadly, I'd really recommend taking a look at the 2035 delivery plan, which we published last summer. And that sets out a really good overview of everything that's going on, not just within OZEV, but across the Department of Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy as well, in the automotive teams and the electricity networks teams who we work really, really closely with. So I'm sure I don't need to tell you that it's a really exciting time in the world of electric vehicles. So industry statistics tell us that over 750,000 plug-in vehicles have been sold in the UK since 2010, and over 1 in 6 cars sold in 2021 had a plug. So it's massive. We're getting there. And government and industry have supported the installation of over 28,500 publicly available charging devices, and that includes more than 5,200 rapid devices, and that's one of the largest networks in Europe. However, I don't want to come across as complacent. I'm really interested to see what those poll results are, but I certainly feel like whilst we're in a good place, there's absolutely no room for complacency. And one of the nice things about, one of the challenges with our role in OZEV is the more successful we are at driving EV uptake, the harder we also make our job, because we're more likely to run into challenges with the rollout of charging infrastructure. But that's a great challenge and a good one to have. So just to put it in context, in order to meet our pretty ambitious carbon targets, we anticipate up to a quarter of the 36 million cars and vans on the UK's roads will need to be electric in 2030. And obviously, to support that, drivers need world-class charging infrastructure to support the full range of journeys that they want to do and the full range of vehicles that will be around in our electric future. So building on the 1.9 billion that was funding that was set out in the Spending Review 2020, at the end of last year, the government committed another £620 million to support the transition to electric vehicles. And this additional funding will support the rollout of charging infrastructure with a particular focus on local on-street residential charging, and also support some targeted plug-in vehicle grants. And in our forthcoming electric vehicle infrastructure strategy, we hope to set this all out in context and define our vision for the continued rollout of a world-leading charging infrastructure network across the UK. So in the strategy, we will be focusing on how we unlock the charge point rollout needed to enable this transition from early adopters to mass market uptake of electric vehicles in a world where they need to work for everybody. And we'll set up our next steps to address the barriers that are still around to private investment, and also how we plan to level up charge point provision, because it's obviously super important that no area of the country is left behind. Other exciting things that we're doing to increase confidence in the charging network and reduce range anxiety, we're working with industry to simplify payment, ensure reliability, and to make public EV charge point data freely available to help drivers easily locate and access charge points. Because if we've got a great network of charge points, but they're a nightmare to use and you can't find them, then that's not that's not really good enough. And we're also committed to ensuring an accessible EV charging network, and that inclusively designed charge points are available for all consumers. And that's why we're partnering with the national disability charity Motability to commission the British Standards Institute to develop accessibility standards for public EV charge points across the country. Now, we're really aware in the Office for Zero Emission Vehicles of the massive opportunity that comes from decarbonising both sort of small and larger fleets around the UK. And we really want to do everything that we can to make this as easy as possible for companies and for the drivers. And one thing we realised through the process of putting together the EV charging infrastructure strategy is that, firstly, the needs of fleet drivers are really varied. And secondly, they're also evolving. So we've heard, for example, and I'd love to know if any of you can tell me if this relates to your experience, but we've heard that since the pandemic, for example, fewer drivers are using depots and more of them are taking home. And this sort of change in driver behaviour could really impact the charging infrastructure requirements for fleets. So I think it's really, really important that as government, we can understand the full range of these needs so that we can work with both local authorities and companies and charge point operators to cater to them. And I've had a little sneak peek at some of the BVRLA work that's coming, and it looks like it's going to be really fantastically useful for us in OZEV. So I'm really excited and looking forward to seeing the full report. So I'm going to stop there. Really happy to answer any questions.
Thanks for that, Katie. Great to hear some of the work that's being undertaken. In terms of reflecting on the poll, not fantastic news. So nearly 60%, 59.2% said no, lots more work is required. So I think we recognise that, and looking forward to working with you to get this right. So one of the first questions that I would like to ask is, we hear a lot, and I know I put a poll up on LinkedIn in advance of this morning's webinar about what the appropriate mix of charging is. And it's quite clear that people want to see a mix of different charging options. So I'd be keen to hear from you what government, what is OZEV doing to ensure that we do have that right mix of charging? And then just as a sort of follow-on question to that, we also hear a lot about how do we make sure it's the right provision, you know, we have the right number of charge points and different people using different metrics. So not only what is government doing to ensure the right mix, but also then to understand a little bit more about the metric that government is using to make sure that we do have the right number of charge points?
Yes, and those two questions are obviously really intrinsically linked, because to come to a number of right charge points implies that you understand or have an opinion on what the correct mix of those charge points is, because obviously one rapid charge point is going to serve a lot more vehicles because they can get through it more quickly than an on-street residential charge point. So it's a fantastically complicated question, which presents itself very simply. And so I think firstly, what's the role of central government in this is obviously the perspective that well, it's my job to think about quite a lot. And so we have done analysis on the different range of charge point numbers that you might need, and it's pretty similar to a lot of the existing estimates that are out there. And you know, what if you take a look at what estimates are out there, what you'll notice is they vary massively. So it's a real challenge to find a metric that works, and it's also, I don't want to even pretend that we know what the right mix is. And equally, I'm not sure central government should be saying what the right mix is, because the really important thing is that the needs of drivers and visitors to a particular area are being met. And by being prescriptive about that, we risk, you know, locking in suboptimal outcomes for people. So getting that balance right of what metrics we use and how prescriptive we are, because obviously there's a real balance to strike in government between being really supportive, removing barriers, ensuring that charge points actually get delivered, but then making sure that the right people are making the decisions about what an area needs. And where this sort of has led us to is actually the decisions about what the right mix of charge points is needs to be taken at that local level. And our role as central government needs to be to equip local authorities and local decision makers with the expertise and the context and the knowledge to make those decisions. But it's not for us to sort of say, well, you need 20% rapid charge points and 70% local charge points. Because not only do the geographic needs of a place vary, there's also just so much uncertainty over time around it, because we don't know how people are going to behave. We know that how people think they're going to charge their vehicle is not necessarily the same as what they do when they actually purchase one, as well as, you know, how technology might evolve. I mean, I could probably spend about 2 hours unpicking these questions, and I'm not trying to. I really don't want to say like, oh, it's not. We don't care about it. We really care about it, but we also really care about making sure that the right decisions for places are in place, rather than us saying you need to do this.
Yeah. Okay. I've got a question here from Neil Page, who has said, given that you want a quarter of all vehicles on the road to be electric quite soon, where will the power come from to charge these vehicles? Even for the most basic electric cars, if they want to charge them at the same time, the additional power required would need 3 nuclear power stations. A lovely word that I can't say. How do you feel about that one?
Yeah, so obviously, if we use more electricity, we will need to generate more electricity, and we need to get on with building that electricity generation. But that is factored in and being actively planned for. So we have, you know, mechanisms to bring forward more nuclear power stations, bring forward more renewable generation. If I'm being completely honest about it, I actually worry more about the network. So how do we get the power to where it needs to be than our ability to create that power in the first place? Yeah, but I mean, the other thing to say is that electric vehicles is really only part of the expansion of electricity generation that we need to see over the coming decades, and sort of challenge of it pales into comparison to what we might be looking at when we think about decarbonising our heating system. So whatever the future looks like, one thing we know is that under every scenario, we need to just get on with building a lot more electricity generation and reinforcing our electricity networks. And so making sure that every organisation in that space is on the same page and is facing up to that challenge is yeah, as I said, it's not just about electric vehicles.
Thanks for that, Katie. I've got another question here around EV charge points. So EV charge points need to be able to accept credit or debit cards, not apps, as this currently means having to have 30 different apps to be able to use the infrastructure. I know that this is something that OZEV has been looking at.
Yeah.
Are you able to share anything in terms of developments in this area?
Yeah, I mean, firstly, totally empathize with that, and it's a problem that we worry a lot about. So and we want to fix. So we did a consultation last year about the consumer experience at public charge points, and one particular focus on that was payment methods. And we're hoping to publish. Again, it's caught up in the government bureaucracy at the moment. But a response to that consultation as soon as we can that will set out our approach to dealing with it. But yes, it's another one of those things where I'm not in a position to give exact details of what we're going to do, but I just, we are on it, and we will fix it as soon as we possibly can, because we recognise how frustrating it is for drivers.
And one of the things that's come out in our research, and I'll be sharing in just a moment, was the sort of payment interoperability side from a fleet perspective, and needing that kind of fuel card equivalent and a sort of roaming solution that works for fleets. Is this something that you're looking at as well?
Yes, we've been looking at that as well. And as soon as we can publish it, I'm sure me or one of my colleagues would love to come back and cover it in more detail. But yes, again, we totally recognise the issues that are there at the moment.
Okay. Okay, so I know when you were talking before, you mentioned about the role of local authorities, and I think we're certainly very conscious that we are going to see more power devolved to local authorities, because they can see what's happening in the local community and what's needed there. What's the role of government in terms of helping to educate those local authorities, and what are you planning to do to sort of help with that education and guidance and giving that sort of central leadership?
Yeah, so we've already got some support in place for local authorities, and as part of the strategy publication, we're hoping to be able to announce a bit more. But we already offer sort of support and guidance service through the Energy Savings Trust. They, for example, will help local authorities put together applications for the on-street residential charge point scheme. They'll help provide some advice and guidance on sort of charge points mixes across the country. So that's in place. We want to continue that. We want to expand it if we can. We also are putting together lots of sort of consolidated practical guidance for local authorities. I think the role of government here is a lot about convening power and helping people learn from each other and bringing examples of best practice and circulating them. But we're always looking also at what more we can do. So yeah, we've got lots that we want to do in this space to help local authorities.
There was a question about when we're going to see the infrastructure strategy, but I think that's the $1 billion question. So I'll leave you off the hook on that one. I can't see any other questions coming in from the audience, so I will continue to think of some of my own. So in terms of the role of fleet, how can fleet support you at sort of national government level, but also locally as well?
Yeah. Information. It's as I said in my sort of opening remarks, the more we understand, the more, because it is a complicated picture with fleets, but equally fleets are a massive opportunity. So the more we understand about how fleets operate, how fleets work, and because you and your members are the expert on that, not necessarily us. The more you can educate us, the more then we can think about how to turn that into solutions that work back for you. So yeah, please just come and talk to us. We're always interested to talk. I think that's the biggest thing, because it's not necessarily information. The information that we need is not necessarily always out there. and available. And to be honest, we don't always, we're going on a bit of a journey with fleets. We're learning what information we need as we go along. And I'm sure, like as part of the strategy as well, that's part of it. It's how do we encourage local authorities to go out and work with the fleets that are in their area, so that they know and are aware of what they're trying to cater for as part of their sort of wider charge point provision in that area.
That's been fantastic, Katie. I think we're out of time, unfortunately, but thanks so much for joining us this morning. And if there were any unanswered questions, I'm sure it's something that we can continue to engage and get answers to those questions and feed them back. Thanks ever so much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so next I am going to share some of the insights from the research that we've recently undertaken and that we're looking to produce next week. So if we start with some of the background, so this basically builds on some of the research that we did with our BVRLA's Road to Zero report card, where we started to set out some of the use cases, some of the challenges with those use cases, and then started to think about the type of charging that may be required. We wanted to expand on that and also to broaden out the use cases, recognizing that more power may get devolved to local authorities. What could we do to help their understanding about fleets? So we're looking to produce a fleet charging guide, and this will demonstrate the diversity of fleet usage. It will show some of the charging challenges for those different user types, and then look at their preferred type of charging based on that usage and the charging types. I've just lost the slides, so hopefully they will come back because I can't see what I'm presenting. But yeah, just to carry on whilst hopefully we get the slides back. So giving the background, what we've then done is develop a whole series of different use cases based on different journey profiles, the different journeys that are undertaken, and then we can match the charging type required to that charging. We've deliberately focused on private sector fleets because this was, first of all, identified as a bit of a blind spot when we've been engaging with stakeholders and with government. But also we recognise that there is some work being undertaken into things like blue light services and council fleets. I'm hoping the slides are going to come back because I really need to talk to the next graphic. And I don't know if it's just that I can't see them or that they've gone for the audience as well. So I don't know if someone can indicate to me. Here we are. There we are. Okay. So just to say, the use cases aren't completely exhaustive, but what we have done is try to put them into categories which we think give a good starting point to show the diversity of fleet and the fleet usage. But it's also a start point in terms of something that we can build on. It's a way that we can start to engage between fleets and government at local, regional and national level. One of the things that will be in the report is this graphic. So this shows how fleets will charge. And what this shows us is the different user types. It gives a bit of a description about the journeys that are undertaken and their particular usage. You can see from the bottom right key, it then points out some of the charging challenges that are specific for that particular user group. And then based on the usage profile and those charging challenges, we've then shown the preferred type of charging, but other types of charging that may be required. So if we can then drill into some of these in a bit more detail. So if we can go on to the next slide where we look at home work. So here we've allocated company car and disabled user to at home and work. It's quite clear when we were interviewing fleets that in many cases, the ones that have done, that have made the sort of early transition are the ones who are going to find it the easiest to do that. So the ones who do have access to either at home and or work-based charging are the ones that have really led the transition. So very much on the company car side of things. And it's now that fleets are starting to look at how they start to transition some of the more difficult use cases. We've also allocated at-home charging as the preferred option for disabled users. We've spoken a bit before about accessibility, and Katie mentioned the fantastic work that OZEV is doing with Motability. We're keen to support that in any way that we can and are looking forward to hearing more as that develops. but also recognising that as the transition continues, although we've allocated both of these user types to at-home work, there will be a number of drivers that don't have the at-home access to be able to charge. So the purple dot is then near home charging, and I'll go on to that in more detail in just a moment. But particularly for disabled users, they are going to need to, if they can't charge at home, then be very, very close to home. For both the company car and the disabled user, they'll also need some form of rapid charging access, particularly en route if they're doing longer journeys. And both may need destination, particularly if they don't have the ability to charge at home or at work, but also if they're using the vehicle for leisure purposes as well, or even for an essential company car driver that needs to do a longer distance and perhaps stay away from home. So if we move on to the next use case. So the next one is at depot. So it's worth noting that at this point in time, we've just focused on cars and vans. I think when it comes to HGVs, we're still not really clear about what the technological solution is going to be, whether it's going to be battery, hydrogen, catenary, a mix of all. So at this stage, it wouldn't be right. It would have been too premature for us to start thinking about their infrastructure requirements. But when we've looked at vans that are depot based, we've put these into two categories. The first is delivery services. So this basically is pretty self-explanatory. It's your parcel deliveries, your food, grocery deliveries, but also delivery of essential goods and services. And then the engineer work van is really anything from your local tradesperson through to the person that comes and installs services, repairs your boiler, vehicle recovery, through to utility providers, and then even construction workers. So this covers a huge amount of use cases that, as I mentioned at the start, we can further build on as this develops further. But important to note, I think, that in a lot of cases with the engineer work van, they're not just transporting the driver or the engineer, but they're also transporting the tools for the trade. So a lot of the tools for the job will be carried within the van as well. So the thing in common with both of these is that they return to the depot overnight, which is why we put them at depot. The key challenge with this is grid capacity. And I think we had some questions that were kind of looking at some of this, but this is where people are looking to put the charging infrastructure in at their depots or at sites. And quite often there's not the capacity for them to be able to do that. This then triggers a whole lengthy process, which can be extremely complex and bureaucratic, engaging with DNOs who perhaps fleet operators have never had to engage with before, but also can be extremely cost prohibitive. So that's one of the key challenges that is facing this group. The other thing is that due to limited range on the vans, so some vans still only capable of doing ranges of around sort of 100 miles or so, and some of these use cases go beyond that, they will still need to top up during the working day. So perhaps whilst completing paperwork or in lunch breaks. So that's why we've said that rapid charging will also be important. And for the engineer work vans, they may need to be maybe on call. They may be required to work away from home. So destination charging would also be quite important here. If we move on to the next one. So in a number of cases, even where there were depot-based, what we found when we did the interviews with a number of fleet operators is that even where they had depot-based models, because of COVID and the increasing number of people working from home, a lot have moved away from that depot-based model. And a lot of the van drivers now take the vehicles home or are based from home. So what we mean by near home is that those drivers are going to need to be able to charge mainly overnight unless they're on call. But where they can charge overnight, we're not saying the power of the charger that would be required, but it would need to be within a sort of 5 to 10 minute walk of that driver's home address. One of the key things here is accessibility of charging. So a lot of the on-street in particular charging has been designed with cars, not necessarily vans. So often the bays are too small, the cables can be too short. But the other issue is security. So because a lot of these vehicles will contain tools, we need to have secure parking for some of these vehicles. And even where there are local car parks which would offer that secure parking, there's accessibility issues with things like height restrictions. So we do need to be able to overcome some of those accessibility and security concerns. I mentioned before about the rapid charging. This would be really important for this group, particularly if they are reliant on public charging that enables them, and they don't have accessible secure parking overnight, then they are going to be reliant on rapid charging. One of the big things that came up from all of the fleet operators that we spoke to was this interoperability, and it was in the question earlier. So people don't want their drivers to have to download a whole myriad of apps to be able to make payment. Particularly where they are going to be so much reliant on public charging infrastructure. But also for fleets, it's really important that there is that roaming solution that enables the more effective, efficient reimbursement and things like that. And then if we move on to the final use case, so this is rapid charging. We've mentioned rapid charging for all of the other use cases so far, but there are some use cases who will be heavily reliant on rapid charging. And in all of these use cases, it's because they have limited downtime. So whether that's a taxi, private hire, ride-hailing company, car club or rental, they all have high levels of utilization and very little downtime. So the average rental vehicle is often turned around in less than an hour, in some cases less than half an hour. So rapid charging is going to be absolutely essential for these groups. Not necessarily just for the business themselves, but also the customers. If the customer is paying by the hour, day to rent a vehicle, they don't want to be sat for hours charging. So again, they're going to probably want to have some form of rapid charging. Destination charging will also be important for those customers who are taking car club and rental vehicles, particularly if they're visiting popular tourist destinations. And things like that. And then for rental in particular as well, because of those high utilization, quick turnaround times, we do have a number of rental members who are then looking at putting this rapid infrastructure at their rental branches. And again, we then go into some of the grid capacity issues that I mentioned before. So if we move on then to the next set of slides. So we've made a series of high-level policy recommendations. These are across 4 areas. We've got 13 recommendations across 4 areas. The first one is matching types of provision to emerging gaps in infrastructure. Here, we're really looking at the support that OZEV can give to local authorities through guidance to ensure that infrastructure is developed in line with users' needs and is of benefit to all. We think that fleets can be a really useful kind of test case as early adopters, but also if we can get the infrastructure right for fleets, then that will set us up very well for the long term and other people making the transition. The second is around building trust in the reliability of infrastructure. So drivers need to trust the network. And this is where we've got the problems of reliability. So I think it's important that local authorities are empowered to introduce and uphold standards, and also to take actions where there are persistent and ongoing issues that remain unresolved. The third area is around consistent ease of access. So this is around the accessibility and the ease of payment challenges that I've mentioned. All drivers, use cases and vehicle types will need to be catered for. And it's really important that this is thought about at the earliest stage and incorporated, particularly on accessibility, built into the planning process. And then finally, we've got creating a future framework for decisions based on user need. This is where we're looking at the role that local authorities can play and really facilitating more effective engagement with all relevant partners, but also looking at how they can utilize the skills and knowledge that is held by fleets and some of those other players, potentially using some of the data that's held, which will help them to ensure that infrastructure meets the needs of users, not just now, but also into the future. Because if they can understand how things are evolving, changing, are those challenges being overcome and what those needs look like, then they can make sure that we've got charging infrastructure that will last for many years to come. So just then to turn to the next steps, we will be publishing the report next week. If we move on to the next slide, we'll be sharing this with mayors, transport combined and local authorities. We'll be engaging with stakeholders to increase awareness of fleet charging needs and looking for opportunities to work collaboratively and jointly with those stakeholders. And then we'll be meeting with OZEV to discuss some of the recommendations within the report and encouraging further guidance and support to local authorities on this issue. And then finally, we'll be looking to you to help support us by cascading the messaging, sharing the report with your key stakeholders, with local authorities. So please keep an eye out on our website next week when we'll be publishing this. And please do help us by liking social media posts and things that we do on the day. If you do want any further information, please do contact us using the email address there, which is policy@bvrla.co.uk. So really looking forward to publishing this next week. And I'll pick up any questions as part of the panel discussion. So before I introduce the panel and we go on to some of the questions, I'd like to introduce our second poll for this morning. So again, if you can look on the poll tab, which is what is your biggest charging challenge? So we've gone into some of the details there, and this is by no means an exhaustive list, but it's quite a long one. So if you can have a look at that, and then perhaps we can reflect on the poll with the panel. So I'd like to introduce the panel this morning. So we have Tom Callow, who's the Head of Insights and External Affairs at BP Pulse. Morning, Tom.
Morning, Catherine.
We have Laura Holloway, the Head of Government and Public Affairs at Enterprise Rent-A-Car. Morning, Laura.
Morning, Catherine.
Chris Jackson, Head of Fleet Business Development at Centrica. Morning, Chris.
Good morning.
And finally, last but not least, we have David Phillips, who's Logistics and Supply Chain Director at Sunbelt Rentals. So good morning to you all. Thanks very much for joining us. Whilst I wait to see the poll results, I'm going to kick us off by asking all of you that question. So what is the biggest charging challenge that you are currently facing? But just to add to that slightly, what are you doing to overcome that challenge, and what are you looking to others to do to help overcome that challenge? So Tom, you're in this space. I'll kick off with you if that's okay.
Sure. So I think the biggest thing at the moment is simply increasing the sort of ramping up the infrastructure that's out there at the moment, making it more visible, giving drivers more confidence. It's not necessarily about the sheer number of charging points, though. I think there's a lot of reports out there about the number of charging points needing to be out there. It's possible to scale up charging provision very quickly by deploying faster chargers, and you get far more throughput through those. So actually, it's about the confidence of where the chargers are, having enough in the right locations. One of the biggest challenges we hear, we recently polled about 2,000 drivers on this, is that the biggest area where people want to see more infrastructure is on the motorway networks. And obviously, we know that is the highest area of unmet demand at the moment, particularly for high mileage fleets. And we've got queues of investment lined up to be spent at motorway service areas, as the CMA found last year, that currently can't be spent due to obviously exclusive provisions of motorway service areas that don't necessarily end until 2026. So that for us is the biggest challenge in terms of getting more charged in strategically important locations at the moment.
Thanks for that, Tom. David, do you want to go next?
Sure, thank you. So within our industry and our organisation, what we're finding right now is a bit of an odd one in terms of what comes first. Is it the vehicle or is it the charge point? Because the two clearly go hand in hand, and we are working through some exercises both in terms of pilot operations on the ground, trying to prove the concept of what does it mean for our mobile operatives who have an electric vehicle. Lots of the stuff that you showed, Catherine, on the previous slides. And then secondly, how much investment do we put into our own charging network versus what's available in the public domain? Because it is a significant capital investment, but organisations like ours really want some form of control, either in the sense of we give home charging units to our colleagues, or we provide a comprehensive network in our locations so that we aren't overly reliant right now on the public charging network.
Thanks, David. Chris, do you want to go next?
Yeah, so for us, we're kind of the biggest challenge for us is identifying the optimal charges for each of our drivers wherever they are. So we kind of map it out for them, to in terms of physically where they are, but also how to get the best out of them. But for us, it's a real challenge for us, because all of our fleet, 10,000 vans, 1,500 cars, they go to home every night. So that's a good challenge and opportunity for us. So it's an evolving picture. The thing I'll kind of sum up with here, that all of our fleet will be done by the end of 2025. So there isn't any great need to panic with this. I'm really confident that we'll have the right infrastructure in the right place, certainly, but in advance of that day, because we know things are improving all the time. And I just encourage everyone here to just be part of solving this challenge.
And Laura, last but not least.
Thanks, Catherine. Well, for us, obviously, we're a business that's led by what our customers want. So there's a variety of different issues, really, some of which are what is the right kind of charger for the right kind of customer, I guess, and how much charging do we need to provide as a business. So we've got 500 locations across the UK. So how many of those need to have charge points? Probably all of them, but at what speed, what type, and how many? And what are the expectations of customers when they're coming to us? So it might be different between whether you're a consumer who's renting a vehicle to take away for the weekend versus a corporate customer who is maybe having that vehicle for a bit longer. So working out what the needs of our customers are and what their expectations of us, and then also to back that up, then what do we need at our own locations? And obviously, in some cases, if that's rapid charging, for example, we run into the issues that I think have been mentioned earlier, and I'm sure a lot of other people do as well, which is whether there's enough power to site at all those different locations, a lot of which are not necessarily in areas where, if you were looking for someone that had the right power, for that area is where you'd put a branch, but obviously you can't just pick up 500 locations and move them to where there's enough power. So the cost and the process of doing that are obviously very important where we need rapid charging. And then obviously the final one, I guess, is to echo what other people are saying, is where we have got consumers who are using electric vehicles and maybe they don't normally use an electric vehicle in their as their private car or as their business car. How do they understand what the charging process is? Do they know where charge points are? How do they find them? Is the network reliable enough? So that's obviously the charging that our customers are doing themselves, but that impacts our ability to rent those vehicles, because no one's going to rent a vehicle if they feel like they can't charge it. So that's probably a good summary of where we are.
Thanks, Laura. And whilst I've got you, Laura, I'll stick with you. So I know when we did the interviews, there was obviously little over-the-counter demand for electric vehicles, and I think you've probably touched on it a bit there. But what do you think needs to change, which will provide your customers with that confidence to opt for an electric vehicle?
Well, I think some of that will come naturally. So as more people are driving electric cars as their own vehicles, that confidence to rent an electric car will increase. But obviously, again, it depends on which kind of customer base we're talking about. In the corporate world, obviously, there has been some increase in the desire to have electric vehicles through some of the kind of legislation, whether it's procurement or other things and targets that businesses have set for themselves. So there's been a bit more demand in that space. But as I mentioned earlier, until those businesses are confident that they can charge the vehicles and use them in the way that they need to as businesses, they're not going to want to rent an exclusively electric fleet, because ultimately they're coming to us not for vehicles that are going to sit there and not move. These vehicles need to be used and need to work for the businesses that have been rented. And then for consumers, that again is about that charging confidence. So that's about a consumer understanding that if they're renting a vehicle to go to Cornwall for the weekend, that they're not going to get stuck on the motorway services, either not being able to charge or can't find a charge point. They're not going to turn up to a charge point, not have the correct card, the correct app, or the correct understanding of how to do it. It's that confidence that they'll be able to do it is going to enable more people to rent. So I suppose, again, it really does depend on what kind of customer type we're talking about, because there really is different needs. And I think the report that you've done bears that out, really, in terms of there are different charging cases depending on what the use case of the vehicle is.
Yeah, thanks for that, Laura. And then David, Chris, from a sort of commercial vehicle perspective, how have you prioritized which of your drivers sort of makes that shift to electric, and then what support are you giving them in terms of that education and that side of things? So Chris, do you want to start on that one?
So we've again, it's no secret that we started with with the easy wins, and that's what I'd encourage anyone looking to do this, where they start. So we did this back in 2013. We call them hand raisers internally for that obvious reason. So that's the people who have got got the space off street. They've not only have they got a driveway, but they're happy to park a bright blue van on it and put it on charge. And often the motivations are, they just don't want to drive a diesel van anymore. So these are your kind of early adopters that every business will have. So they are definitely the priority, because they're the ones that will give you really good, robust, honest feedback on what the situation is, how to improve it, and they'll kind of, in the right forum, they'll kind of spread the word and make it easier for others who are maybe a little bit on the fence to understand that actually this is doable. So the thing I would say is choose your initial drivers wisely, because they'll be a real asset to you, to making the entire rollout a success.
And David?
So we've started with a whole host of analysis, telemetry analysis, to look at where these vehicles are going, what they are delivering and collecting, whether they are for delivery service you referenced, whether they are for engineering type activities. And we've identified 3 pilots nationally now that are going to get moving in March of this year. So, and to Chris's point, we have spent a lot of time looking at our colleagues who are mobile, who have off-street parking, who are willing to be part of the pilot. They want to move away from a traditional diesel van, and we're building that profile now. So very, very similar process to Chris, a little bit behind in terms of where Chris appears to be. And then the final point as well is the different types of vehicle that's available, because again, vehicles are designed to do specific things for specific businesses, and you've got to find the right vehicle to give the confidence to the driver who is used to the convenience of the traditional diesel setup that we've all become so used to. And you've got to try and replicate as closely as possible that same scenario. So when they leave their home in the morning to the point at which they return in the evening, it's as seamless and pain-free as possible.
Yeah, thanks, David. And whilst I've got you, David, I feel like it was quite interesting, and I know certainly when we did the interview, I found it really interesting. You made the point again this morning about some of the issues with depot-based charging, and whether you do actually continue looking at the depot-based model, or whether you start relying more heavily on public charging infrastructure. So what are some of the challenges that you've faced with the sort of depot-based, and are you able to share anything in terms of how you think you may balance the depot versus public charging?
Yeah, sure. I mean, the first thing is that no one person or organization has got all the right answers here. So you are effectively starting with a blank piece, a bit of an amateur expert in what all this means. You've got to find a lot of stuff out for yourself in terms of how it works. Some good examples: we've partnered with a couple of our customers who are helping us through this process, through them providing to us some turnkey, almost consultancy. So from a mutual business perspective, that's been good, because we're now developing reciprocal business with our customers, and they're helping us through the process of load monitoring. So does the site have enough capacity even to cope with the smallest amount of additional charge? What's the process to apply to the DNO when you find out that your site doesn't have the capacity? And if it doesn't, what do you do? Do you just decide to park that particular location and focus on those sites that you do have capacity? Again, within commercial property, and this is all new stuff that you start to find out, is that there's been a traditional way that we've set up those units over time, and now with the influx of depot-based charging, all of that effectively needs to be re-looked at, and that makes for some interesting conversations. The final piece of this is that when you get into that application, it's the length of time. I've sort of started to say internally, actually installing and commissioning the charger at the end is actually the easiest part of the whole process. It's everything that goes up to that in terms of load monitoring, application, how much additional power do you want to apply for, who's your DNO, how do you get in contact with those people, what's the process, and also how much is it going to cost you, and what that looks like as you depreciate that over time. It's a really brain tasking exercise that you do need to step up to in terms of the resource that you're going to put in it as an organization.
Thanks, David. And Tom, one for you. So obviously there's a big call to make sure that we've got the charge points there in the first place, but also the issues around the sort of reliability, ease of payment, things like that. As a sort of charge point operator, how are you balancing the sort of provision versus the reliability, etc.?
Yeah, I mean, there's been obviously significant kind of concerns, I think, around reliability, and I think most of them are sort of related to what I would call legacy infrastructure. And obviously, the UK was one of the first markets to get into electric vehicles in quite a significant way. It was still one of the leading markets in Western Europe, at least. So there's a lot of legacy infrastructure out there. It's been in the ground for probably sort of 5 to 10 years now. And a lot of it was installed in quite peculiar ways. So you had Katie obviously on earlier. Government's doing great things now. We're very supportive of things like rapid charging funds, but actually some of the earliest government grants, for example, went out to local authorities to install charging points with no thought about how they would be maintained, for example, in future, right? So you've got this sort of legacy estate out there of charge points that need to be transitioned, that need to be sort of adopted. It's a lot easier to build from the ground up. So where, for example, where we, as BP, Pulse have invested in markets like China, Germany, we've got 3,000 rapid ultra-fast charging in China, sort of 97, 98% uptime, with the leading ultra-fast charging network in Germany now with 99.6% uptime. So building from the ground up is a lot easier in terms of sort of ironing out issues. It's you know, we're essentially having to smooth out a bumpy road in terms of some of the legacy that the BP inherited with the acquisition of the legacy Chargemaster business, for example, which tends to be one of the challenges I think people face. But actually, when you look at the sort of utilization levels and actually kind of what customers are doing and voting with their feet, I think you see a slightly different story. I mean, we doubled our network utilization from 2020 to 2021. So we went from 16 million kilowatt hours in the year to 32 million kilowatt hours in the year. We've got far more customers using the network now. So actually the utilization is going up, customer sort of, I guess, retention is going up, loyalty is going up. I think what we're not doing is necessarily challenging some of the misperceptions that are out there that are actually related to some of the parts of the network that need the most attention. So that's where our investment's going. So we're investing millions in upgrading legacy chargers and actually tackling the problems with some of the oldest chargers on the network. That's not without its problems. As I said, some of them are owned by third parties. So we physically have to go through a bit like David was saying with DNOs. We physically have to go through quite sort of challenging administrative process to actually get these things upgraded. We can't, in some cases, we can't actually go and touch the charge point. You know, we're not legally allowed to go and repair it or maintain it without permission. So that's a challenge, but we are absolutely, committed to doing it. And obviously, certainly from BP's perspective, it's been serving drivers for over 100 years. So it kind of knows what it's doing in terms of customer experience in that respect.
Thanks, Tom. And also, on that point, we're seeing huge sort of supply parts issues across our industry. Is that something that you're suffering as well from a charge point operator? And also, have you got people with the necessary skills to then do that maintenance?
Yeah, we have. I mean, the parts point was something that affected the charge point industry as well. So the semiconductor issues around things like this. I mean, silly things like screens on chargers were in short supply potentially from some manufacturers. But there are also instances where some of this technology is being effectively stress tested in earnest for the first time. So some of the big charge point manufacturers out there that are being used by multiple networks in the UK, for example, they have this sort of Rolls-Royce image in the market. But actually, when you deploy their technology, you're sort of told, well, actually, we haven't really tried it in this environment before with the levels of utilization you're expecting. So we're not really sure it's going to work. And, you're almost a guinea pig for trying out the technology. So what you're seeing is basically established market players, as well as some startups, deploying relatively new technology in a very fast-growing market, and that is a recipe for having some teething problems that we're going to work through. But I think we should all take confidence in the fact this stuff is going to get ironed out. The business case is there, the commercial imperatives there. If those things weren't there, it would be more doubtful. But I think there's a huge amount of will, a huge amount of investment going into the industry, and I think that's what we need to focus on is actually the improvements that are already being made, that have been made, and have the confidence that we'll be in a very different position by sort of 2025 and certainly by 2030.
Thanks, Tom. And one of the key bits of the fleet charging guide that we're producing is around the sort of calls on central government to give better guidance and support to local authorities, but then local authorities to also help with that facilitation, bringing together the different range of partners. So asking all of you, what would your key ask of the local, or your key ask or offer actually be to the local authority and to the sort of regional and central government as well? I don't know who wants to start with that one. Don't all volunteer at once.
I can start.
Thanks, Laura. Go ahead, Laura.
I suppose I would just, and it's something that we say to government all the time, is that yes, I can understand why they have a large focus in the public charging network on how consumers will charge and on those kind of publicly available charge points. That's absolutely fine, but they can't forget that actually a lot of the charging will be done in private infrastructure and private real estate. So don't forget that actually we've got two different types of infrastructure here. We've got the public network, but we've also got a huge network that's going to be needed of private chargers, and particularly for businesses like ours, but not just ours, our customers and anybody else that operates a fleet or uses electric vehicles. So at the moment, I don't really think there's anything in the government strategy that even kind of addresses this. I know we've got the National Infrastructure Strategy coming out shortly, hopefully. I know OZEV and not able to exactly commit to the date on that, but I don't think we're expecting that to necessarily address this issue at all. So again, not to harp on about it, but the grid capacity issue, that's a huge issue for private charging, and it will remain a huge issue until something's done about it, and whether that's on the process or it's actually on the funding for it. And then, for example, how local authorities work around charging infrastructure. At the moment, all of the funding that local authorities get must be exclusively spent on public charging. Again, absolutely fine, but there's no way to mutualise that cost. There's no way to say, well, look, there's a business adjacent to where we're going to put in these public charge points that's also going to want to electrify that particular location. Well, how are we going to work together? How are we going to bring together different businesses and kind of spread and mutualise that cost? There's no guidance to local authorities, and actually even goes further in a lot of the funding that they've received. There's specific restrictions on how they can actually work with the private sector, who might also need charging as well. So I think the government needs to kind of look at that more in the round and think, actually, how are we going to help that kind of private infrastructure? And that isn't necessarily about them funding private infrastructure. It's about making the conditions right so that either you can mutualise costs or that the conditions are going to be right to install that infrastructure. And, I haven't really seen anything from government that really targets that yet.
Thanks, Laura. Chris, I could see lots of nodding then. Do you want anything to add?
The only thing I'll kind of add on all really good points is talk to us. We're happy. For fleets like us, then, we're happy to share our experience and, more importantly, our data up to the, with agreed restrictions in place. But collectively, as business critical fleet operators, we're happy to work with local authorities, charge point operators, investors, to help put that infrastructure in the right place. One company can't do it, one organisation can't do it. Collectively, over a period of time, I genuinely think we can, but we do need to have more higher standards and more rigorous ways of working together, and particularly with central and local government. Thanks,
Chris. David, anything from you?
I think that it's just really, from my perspective, sort of 18 months down the line, is to be able to provide clarity and ease at which you have to work through the process. That's what I can see the strategy and the investment will start to pay fruition as we move forward through 2022, 2023. Chris referenced his fleet will be done by 2025. So as this thing escalates, it's to remain clear about how you apply and how you invest, and then also to make sure that there is sufficient resource within the government bodies in order to cope with organisations like ours who come to the party looking for additional capacity as we build our fleets.
And Tom, final word from you.
Yeah, I think really from our point of view, it's about making sure that there's consideration of what people need, but in the context of their charging experience versus what they say they want or think they want. There's a big leap being made around on-street charging, for example. Clearly, if someone can have a charge point installed at home, if they've got the space, they're almost certainly going to get one. But the fact that someone parks on street does not necessitate them charging on street, in our view. There's a great blog, if you Google Field Dynamics, 5%, they've got a great blog about the 5% they think really need to charge on street, including, for example, disabled customers you mentioned earlier, Catherine. But actually, if you can provide sort of abundant ultra-fast charging, locally to people, you can avoid that 5 to 10 minute walk to the charge point in the morning, because actually they did it yesterday, and the 15-20 minute round trip walk actually is a 15-20 minute 200-mile range charging session somewhere at a hub or a forecourt. So providing ultra fast charging ubiquitously is going to be incredibly important, and it also helps answer the what if scenarios. So if local authorities can unlock those kind of sites, it means that if someone wakes up in the morning and has forgot to plug in overnight, or there was a disruption to their power supply, it's not going to be a big deal for their day. They can go and charge quickly somewhere locally. If we're completely reliant on slow on-street infrastructure everywhere, clearly, your day is going to be massively disrupted if you wake up with an empty battery and suddenly realize you've got 300 miles of range to drive. It's going to take you hours and hours to charge. So we need that infrastructure in place. That's the stepping stone. We can move into sort of slow dynamic charging when it appears, but we need to accelerate the adoption of ultra fast charging, around the country first before we do anything else in our view.
Thanks, Tom, and thank you all so much. Unfortunately, we're out of time, but thanks so much for joining us. Thank you to all of our speakers for this morning. Thank you to you, the delegates, for your lively chat, discussion and debate. Just to flag the next Fleets in Charge webinar, I'm hoping there's a slide to remind me of the date because I don't remember off the top of my head. The next Fleets in Charge webinar is, I think, in April, where we're going to be discussing everything batteries. So that's on the 27th of April. There should be a link in the chat, but we'll also be emailing out later today a link where you can register for that webinar. So we hope to see you then. And then finally, we also have a number of learning and development courses that we're running. So course dates there with some of our most popular courses. So electric vehicles. We have the operational technical support for cars on the 30th of March. For vans on the 22nd of March, and understanding salary sacrifice on the 24th of February. So please do contact us either via our website or training@bvrla.co.uk. And we look forward to seeing you at the next Fleets in Charge webinar in April. Thanks very much. Take care, everybody.